Recording episode 1 of Tech Tips HIPAA.
Beep.
Boop. Megan. Burns copper.
That's how we're doing this.
Welcome.
Welcome back to another episode of Tech Tips. My name is Sean Root.
And I'm Chris Tripp, and we're with neoRhino IT Solutions.
And today we're joined by Megan Burns Copper, our Senior Compliance Associate, and we're going to talk about HIPAA today. So, Megan, what is HIPAA?
HIPAA, that's a big question. So HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's kind of a lot to it, so be patient with me. I'm going to kind of go into a whole lot here. So it was signed into law by President Clinton in '96. Its main kind of concept was to provide security provisions and mandates and standards for health care information. So it's kind of broken down into a few parts since '96. A lot more has been added to it. So you've got the privacy rule in 2000, and that was introduced to establish national standards to protect individuals' data. And basically this is where you're going to see the definition of PHI, and we're going to be talking a lot about PHI when you talk about HIPAA. That's pretty much all that it kind of centers around. So that stands for Protected Health Information. Under HIPAA, protected health information is, I'm going to give you the real definition. So it's individually identifiable information relating to the past, present, or future health status of someone, and that information is created, collected, or transmitted, or maintained by a HIPAA-covered entity in relation to the provision of healthcare, payment for healthcare services, or use in healthcare operations.
It's very specific as to what exactly PHI is and what we're trying to protect here.
Right.
Or they are with the HIPAA law.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's kind of the juicy kind of the center bit of it. It's all kind of crafted around that.
Okay.
And so you've got the security rule that's introduced in 2003, which establishes the national standards to protect individuals' electronic personal health information. So basically around that point in time, data is starting to be stored more and more in electronic formats as opposed to physical. You're not seeing the vaults anymore in clinics or in hospitals. Our vaults are now our servers, right? So more regulation or standards were crafted around what we call ePHI. That's just basically the electronic form of PHI.
Okay.
Then from there, we've got a few other things. So I'm going to go through those, real quick. So you've got the breach rule, just mandates on standards of how to handle a breach. Enforcement just kind of goes more into how the people who enforce HIPAA, how they do that, and what gives them the power to do so. And then you've got the high-tech law, which is not actually technically a part of the HIPAA law itself. It is its own standalone piece of legislation that was passed in 2009, and that basically expands the idea of data breach notifications and a little bit more structure on how to protect ePHI. High tech, it's in the name. It's centered around more on how to handle ePHI and data in electronic format.
Today's technology.
Exactly.
Okay.
So one of the biggest pieces of high tech was sort of the incentivization for moving to an EHR. So an EHR is, it stands for Electronic Health Record. Essentially, it's a platform on which clinics or people that handle PHI, it's an electronic space to be able to hold that and hold it securely.
Okay, and so usually those EHRs, do they always follow that HIPAA regulation of security and all that stuff, because they are kind of hosting all your PHI at that moment?
Sure, yeah. And that's kind of a loaded question just
Okay.
because, I can't guarantee that any EHR, is, but I would certainly hope so since that's...
Or at least be something to look into. Hey, are y'all HIPAA compliant whenever you're looking for an EHR?
Right, well, yeah, and
Okay.
there are definitely questions that a covered entity or a clinic or whomever should ask when looking for a tool like that,
Right.
Especially when it comes to certain levels of security that they may need or
require,
can't
yeah.
afford. Right, yeah, exactly. That's kind of one of the big things with HIPAA is it is supposed to be flexible, so they'll usually work kind of with you if you're not a huge, Memorial Hermann, you're a little small clinic, you're
Yeah.
not going to have the same expectations of, all the different levels of security or encryption or whatnot.
Right.
But
Because that can get pricey.
sure,
Yeah.
yeah. But you should still be putting forth effort,
To protect your patient's information.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right, and so with that, who would all be affected under HIPAA?
So that's where we get into the definition of covered entity. So a covered entity, as it's written in the law, is a health plan, a healthcare clearinghouse, or a healthcare provider who electronically transmits any health information in connection with transactions for which HHS has adopted standards. So as an example, you've got hospitals, academic medical centers, physicians, healthcare providers who transmit PHI. Those would all be covered entities under HIPAA. So those are the people who are going to be responsible for following and upholding standards to HIPAA. Now you've got your covered entities, and then you've got their business associates, and kind of how it sounds. A business associate is a person or entity that performs certain functions or activities that involve the use or disclosure of PHI. So usually, you've got a vendor or someone who handles the data but doesn't, actually, interact with patients on that level.
Right.
Shredding companies or, MSPs, that sort of thing.
Right.
They'd be considered business associates to the covered entities.
Okay.
And business associates kind of have their own level of responsibility. Usually it is the covered entity holding the business associate responsible. And then they have to enter into an agreement, and both sides have to sign what's called a BAA, Business Associate Agreement. Lots of acronyms in HIPAA.
At least they make sense.
Yeah.
Mostly, yes.
Some of the IT acronyms, you're like, why?
Right. But as long as both parties enter into that agreement, and the covered entity contractually holds the business associate accountable, that's basically covering that portion of that standard.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Excellent. And
Actually, I want to make a quick note.
Yeah,
Remember,
go ahead.
that's a federal stipulation. So HIPAA and the covered entities and how they interact with their business associates, that's a federal thing. So we'll see later that states have more stringent, or they can have more stringent specifications depending on what state you live in.
So
Right.
since it's a federal thing, what are the consequences? Say you don't follow that HIPAA compliance or anything like that. What happens to that company or that health place?
So there are consequences. Now, one of the biggest reasons why you want to follow HIPAA, I just want to throw out there.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are going to be legal ramifications and there are financial ramifications. But many companies should want to follow HIPAA because a lot of what HIPAA crafts is, or what should be, what ethical companies consider to be common sense.
Right.
And so it kind of asks and pushed for the questions like, how are you ensuring the protection of your patient's data? Or how are you holding your staff accountable for protecting your patient's data? There's I feel like I'm trailing off. So
No, you were
I'm
fine. So I guess with that, how do you have to call people who know how to get you HIPAA compliant, or do you have a specific person in the company, or can you kind of have both, a hybrid version? How does staying HIPAA compliant, I guess, how does that work? Do you just call a person up and say, hey, can you review my company and tell me what's wrong? Or does that person always have to report, hey, these guys are doing something wrong to the feds, so that they can, come back through and say, hey, we're going to fine you for all this stuff?
Yeah, there are, kind of a lot of different levels of things. Now, I guess if you want to kind of go with how to start, or sort of what the sort of primary focus should be. So you mentioned if there are people, in the company that are kind of focused on that. So
Yeah.
part of HIPAA is sort of the requirement of naming a privacy and a security officer.
Okay.
So there are individuals in your company that you should identify as sort of ultimately
Responsible
accountable.
for that, yeah.
Right. That being said, that doesn't have to be someone who is necessarily an expert, just someone who is kind of going to be that point of contact.
Yeah.
And the kind of the first thing that you want to do is to do a risk assessment.
Mhm.
And that is something that you can do internally. It is something that you can do
Through a contractor.
through someone else,
or something
right?
like that. Okay.
And in fact, it is suggested that you do both.
Oh,
Obviously,
okay.
if you look at your own surroundings, you may or may not.
You let some things slide because you're used to it, or like, that's just kind of the
Sure.
way we do things, and then somebody can come in behind you and be like, hey,
That's not
you
really the way.
aren't doing this right.
Yeah, right. So reaching out to an external person, I think once every few years, at the very least, is usually recommended that way. Just kind of, like
Make
you
sure
said.
you're staying up to date and
Right.
have all that stuff taken care of on the federal level, rather than
Exactly.
your self-knowledge. And hey, I looked this up online. Of course, all the entirety of the law is online, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
There are several
essentially, we can look
sources.
this up and read it all. But from my knowledge, is that you took quite a long time just reading through a majority of the law, and there's a lot to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
and there's a lot to kind of understand, so there are little details, like there are particular safeguards that are considered addressable versus required, and
Okay.
to know what that means, and kind of how to be able to handle that, and how it applies to your environment.
Right.
Like I said before, it's supposed to largely be flexible and kind of scale to your
So environment-specific
right.
policies and procedures for maintaining HIPAA compliance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's kind of the pattern that you'll start to see
Mhm.
is a lot of the requirements mention. So there's kind of a structure to it. It lists a standard, sort of a overall principle that you kind of have. They conceptually they want you to uphold,
Mhm.
and then it'll require a policy that essentially follows that standard. So,
Okay.
as an example, you've got facility access controls, and it kind of goes into what it means to have those facility access controls and kind of why. But then you've got your implementation specifications, which includes, you need to have a policy that, has your security plan. You need to have access control and validation procedures and certain things that kind of stack up to uphold that standard.
Okay.
So you'll really kind of see the need for the policy, and then the need for the procedures or the logs or the data that needs to be held on to show that you're upholding those.
And so basically HIPAA, people who check for compliance are really just looking for, hey, do you have that flow? Do you have that policy in place?
Right.
And are you actually following it?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. So say you get found with a HIPAA violation, essentially. How long would a company have to remediate that issue, and is it dependent on the issue itself?
So I think it is really dependent on the issue. As far as length of time, usually that's something that is discussed with the OCR. So the OCR is the Office of Civil Rights. They're the ones that are held to enforcing HIPAA. They essentially will, identify something, they'll investigate, and then you'll kind of work something out with them, essentially, depending on what it is. And a lot of that depends on if it's just negligence or if it's willful neglect that is causing the violation.
So
So
those are defined.
Right.
So it's like if they notice someone's willfully neglecting this law, then essentially they'll get a worse punishment than like, oh, we
Yes.
actually just had no clue.
Right.
Okay.
So to kind of put some visceralness to it, for just pure negligence, so you didn't really know, or you're doing something and it's not, you're not trying to go out of your way to harm. You're just you just didn't do this.
Okay.
So just pure negligence. It's $1,000 per violation under HIPAA.
Okay.
As opposed to willful neglect, where it's pretty obvious that you knew that this wasn't supposed to happen and you did it anyway. You've got $10,000 per.
Oh, wow. So
violation.
it's a 10 times the money
Yeah.
increase just for, hey, I knew this was a problem but didn't do anything about it,
Yeah.
compared to, I had no idea this was a thing.
Yes.
Okay.
And then that is if you will fix it within 30 days. If you
Oh.
don't fix it within 30 days, or you're not able to fix it within 30 days, that goes up to $50,000.
Oh, wow.
A violation.
Wow.
So it can stack up. But
Strict time frame too.
Yeah.
30 days, hey, you need to implement this entire policy and procedure or whatever you need to implement.
right.
And it can essentially go up to, what'd you say, 50,000?
50,000.
Yeah, jeez. Yeah.
That's a lot.
Per violation.
Per violation.
So if you've
yeah.
got, 10 different people's records, essentially I believe that would be counted as, 10 different
10 different
Violations.
breaches and
so-
violations, yeah. But I'm not a lawyer,
Easily
so I
jumped
I
up to
can't speak for that.
500,000 with just 10 violations, though. And violations are not something that are hard to come by whenever you're trying to actually find out your compliance,
Right.
from what I've seen.
Yeah.
So are you only really fined for larger violations though, or is it? Do you have any examples of a smaller situation?
So, so from what I can tell, so the HHS puts all of their, cases and their investigations up on their website. So, you can actually go on there now and look at, over the last, I think it's the last 6 years they've got data for,
wow.
cases and companies that violated and kind of the conclusion for that and what they did. A lot of things that you'll see in those examples are the OCR coming in and holding them to what they call a corrective action plan.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see, there will be a violation. The OCR will come in and say, hey, you did this wrong. Go ahead and just, implement this plan. And most of the time they'll still get fined.
Mhm.
But it'll be a lot less than what it would have been had they not implemented it. But there, as I can tell, there isn't really such a thing as like a smaller violation, as far as like priority of violation.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the more violations you do, it can stack up.
Right.
But as far as the violations themselves, I don't see necessarily if they're categorized, differently. So like as an example, there was an orthopedic clinic, and this is all on the HHS website. There was an orthopedic clinic that was fined. Let's see, it was $750,000 because the clinic didn't sign a BAA with with a vendor of theirs.
Oh my.
There was some issue obviously with the PHI that they were handling, and even with a corrective action plan, it was still $750,000. So
Wow.
it can stack up.
Yeah.
And that just sounds like they really just didn't get a document out and say, hey, we're going to be business associates, here's the agreement.
This
That
is how
just
we're
didn't
holding
happen.
you, right?
And so $75,000 for something as simple as, hey, I didn't print out a document to have signed, could be pretty detrimental to a company.
Yeah, that's something that's pretty simple to do,
Right.
and it's kind of one of those I guess foundational, fundamental pieces.
Right.
But it, you wouldn't think something as simple as a signature on a piece of paper would cost you, $750,000.
Oh, 750. Sorry, I said 75,000 earlier. That's
Oh, man.
even more intense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
10
lot of
times
money,
more.
you know, for just not having a piece of paper. So it's just, you know, little things that you can do to make sure you're good.
Wow,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
That's pretty important. So yeah, I think with that, I think maybe one other question for you here today is how do you stay protected and stay compliant?
So really a good place to start is, like I said, a risk assessment.
Right.
That kind of gives you your baseline, and it really identifies where you, where you're vulnerable, where you need to, add more policy or structure to your workflow. There's a lot of pieces too in HIPAA. If it doesn't apply to you, that's completely acceptable. You just have to kind of state and justify why that's the case. But if you want to kind of get an idea of sort of what's involved in becoming compliant or staying compliant, a good place to start is to look at the law itself. So, especially what they call the security rule. You've got safeguards in there that are cleanly defined. And that's kind of where you're going to see most of, the how. In the other places of the law, it's kind of like, obviously you need to pay attention to all of it.
Right.
But, this is kind of it lists sort of like the physical, what you can do.
Okay.
And there is, aptly there's a section specifically named physical safeguards. So it kind of lists out, physical safeguards that you can take to.
And that's all on the website, right? So basically we can look up the law on the website, and then if we need, we can just provide the website down underneath this YouTube video, and then someone can look it up and see all the details rather than all the little specifics.
Yes.
So that would be handy for someone to go through if they're trying to become HIPAA compliant.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to the physical safeguards, there's administrative safeguards, there's technical safeguards, there's organizational requirements. That's all in the security rule, aptly named because it's all about security and how how you're going to, implement security.
And that's really just one rule under all the additional rules of HIPAA. So you have the HIPAA law, and then those rules are separate things that you also have to know.
Right, because HIPAA was its own thing in '96. You've got the privacy rule in 2000. So, there's
4-year difference.
Right.
Of new technologies and all that fun stuff. So
yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I think with that, we've pretty much covered the basis of HIPAA, unless there's anything else you guys can think of or have any extra questions, concerns.
I have no more
I
questions.
think I have any questions.
All right.
Sure.
Thank you all again for joining us for another episode of Tech Tips. My name is Sean Root.
And I'm Chris Tripp.
This is Megan Burns-Copper.
Ta-da!
This was not discussed.
All right, we'll do it again. All right. So thank you for joining us again for another episode of Tech Tips. My name is Sean Root.
And I'm Chris Tripp.
I'm Megan Burns-Copper.
So if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below or go to neoRhino.com/techtips.
We'll also be leaving the links to all this HIPAA information on the YouTube video. So if you want to learn more or get involved with HIPAA, you can most certainly go to those links and learn a lot of details. We know Megan sat there probably for maybe a year just reading over a good chunk of the information, right?
Just go through it, go through it.
And just reiterate. So yeah, it's definitely always a helpful thing to have that law known, especially if you're going to be working in that field. And also, we're with neoRhino, so if you all need any assistance, we are here to help.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you guys once again. I hope you have a good day.
Have a good one.